All right, folks. So today we're going to talk a little bit about 10 things to look for when buying an HF radio. It doesn't matter if it's your first radio or if it's your next radio. These things are all applicable. And really the goal of buying an HF radio is to maximize value and minimize regret. When you pick out a radio, it's a really personal choice. So you can ask people, hey, what radio should I get? But you're going to get an opinion that's tailored to them and what they're trying to do. And your goals and objectives might be a little bit different. So we're going to go through a list of things just to look out for and consider. We want to avoid any costly mistakes. We don't want to buy a radio we regret, a radio we wish we didn't buy, and a radio that we need to flip. A lot of times people will make price concessions and buy a cheaper radio just because it's cheaper. And then they sell that radio at a loss and buy another radio. And it's going to cost them more money in the long run. Look at the radio as an investment that you're making into yourself, into your hobby. And it's something that potentially could increase in value, most likely decrease. But amateur radios, especially HF radios, tend to hold value pretty well. So if you do make a mistake and get something you don't want, the used market's pretty strong. So for me, the most important thing to consider is receiver performance. If a radio can't hear, it's not going to be fun. You're not going to have a good time. It doesn't matter if somebody can hear you. If you can't hear them, then you've got a little bit of a problem. So there's some things that we look at. We want a radio that has good sensitivity. Sensitivity means that it can hear signals, especially weak signals or distant signals that might not be coming through as strong as everything else. Sensitivity is the ability for a radio to hear them and relay them to you in a way that's consumable. Now we have something called selectivity, and this allows you to focus in on a particular signal, allows you to isolate that from background noise and from other signals that might be coming through your radio interface. So it's a combination of sensitivity and selectivity that you're looking for, especially if you're going to operate in digital modes where it's very crowded, or if you're operating in contests or weekends, even in crowded bands. Selectivity is very important. And the last thing I wanted to cover is take a look at the receiver's dynamic range. So the dynamic range is the difference between your noise floor and the received signal strength. The more dynamic range that your receiver has, the better it's going to hear and receive. A lot of times you'll see in more lower priced radios, or some of the cheaper radios, is they'll have lower dynamic range. And a lot of us operate in environments that have very high noise floors, lots of interference from power lines, electronic devices, LED lights, who knows what. And if you have a poor dynamic range, your signal to noise ratio is poor, and that means you're going to struggle to hear. Receiver performance is probably the top consideration that you want to look at. Coupled with receiver performance are filtering options. Some radios have better filters than other ones. Today, most modern radios, or contemporary radios, I should actually correctly say, have the ability to have adjustable filter width. Some of them have two filters, and you can slide them back and forth, like the ICOM's twin bandpass filtering. But the ability to tailor your filter, adjust the skirts, contouring potentially, like on the Yaesu radios, the better that you're going to be able to hear and isolate those signals. Now, if you're jumping from signal to signal to signal, it might be a little bit of a problem. But at the same time, if you're calling CQ, you might be able to tailor your filters to hear the signals that are coming in just to you, especially on crowded bands. A lot of the more modern contemporary radios have digital signal processing, or DSP. And this allows you to modify the signal once it's come into your radio, gone through its mixing stage, and the DSP will allow you to monitor or to modify that signal for your needs. Some radios come with the ability to add what's called a roofing filter, or might have built-in roofing filters. And what they do is they actually filter down your signal before it gets to the DSP. So radios that don't have these pass noise and interference into your DSP for your DSP to clean up. If you have roofing filters, what the roofing filter does is help isolate that signal before it's processed, giving you cleaner output and a better signal fidelity. The last thing are notch and noise filters. So what notch filters can do is that if on the frequency that you're operating, we operate on a little span, a little cut of frequency, there might be interference from people tuning up, or you might hear birdies, as people call them, or interference or noise. What a notch filter does is allow you basically to carve that out of your passband, and you won't hear the noise. Very handy. I actually have a video showing how to do this on the 7300. Notch filters are super duper essential. And then noise filters will do things like noise suppression, bring down static, bring down background noise, and they are important as well. So we talked a little bit about receiving quality. The next thing that you want to do is make sure that you're producing a good, clean signal. And you want to make sure that your power output is working as advertised. But more important than just power output is the clarity of the output. Some radios will come with filters that will allow you, or equalizers that will allow you to tailor your voice to the signal. You can use monitor functions on some radios and hear what you sound like. Now that's going to sound before it's modulated, right? That's not the signals being transmitted. It's an approximation of that. You can use things like web SDRs to hear yourself and hear how you sound and potentially do any adjustments there. Not all radios give you the ability to contour your output signal. The other thing is you want to make sure your signals are very clean. So we do a lot of testing on this channel for harmonics and things like that. So when your radio produces harmonic frequencies or has problems with distortion, your signal isn't as clean and people might struggle to hear you. The other one is we have tunable output. And this would be adjustable settings like output gain or power levels that you can set for your radio to make sure that, one, you're adhering to local transmission rules if that's something for you, and making sure that you sound good. Now, one thing is that like people will always be like, I got my settings from so-and-so. He told me exactly how to do my settings. And you don't necessarily want to do that. Everybody's voice is different. Everybody's operating conditions are different. Your settings need to be tailored for you and your environment. So I want to talk a little bit about band coverage and choosing the bands that you actually use. So where I operate from my house, most of my radios do 160, but I'm never going to put up a 160 meter antenna here. I just don't have the space. It's rare that I would do anything on 80 meters. So maybe I don't need to consider those. Most radios come 80 through 10 or 80 through 6. Some radios will come 160 through 10 and not include 6 meters. 6 meters may be important to you or not. What's gotten really popular lately are these smaller QRP portable radios that do UHF, VHF, and HF. That might be something that's important to you. Now, I know that there's older legacy radios like the 991A, for example, or the ICOM 7100, I believe is what it is. They're what we call shack in a box, and they go from 160 to 70 centimeters. The general impression people used to always say is that, well, it does everything okay, doesn't do one thing well. And that's true. You can get really high-end HF radios that do HF beautifully. They don't do VHF or UHF. In some cases, they do. Sometimes they'll do 2 meters. I think over in Europe, there's a 4-meter band that they use. So take a look and decide, is it really worth it for you to buy a shack in the box? Or do you want to just focus on HF? Or in some cases, you might just want UHF and VHF. So take a look at band coverage. And I think the important point here is don't spend money on something that you're not going to use. If you already have a UHF, VHF radio that you love and you like and you want to use it, don't get it added into your HF radio. One of the things I'll mention, the argument that always comes up is people are like, well, I want to do 2-meter single sideband. 2-meter single sideband, I think sounds great. It's fun and people can do it. And people who do that love it. But I know lots of people that have 2-meter capability on their HF radio who've never done 2-meter single sideband. So why pay for it if you're not going to use it? Another thing that comes up is tuner capability. And a lot of people say, well, do I want a tuner? Do I not want a tuner? So one of the first radios, my first big boy 100-watt HF radio that I bought was the ICOM 7300. And I was really excited for that because it had a built-in tuner. And I was like, oh, I'm saving money by buying this radio because I don't have to get an external tuner. Well, there's a problem. So I set up a random wire antenna, which is really not resonant on any of the amateur radio frequencies, but it's multi-banded, and it was actually a really nice antenna. I loved it. But the challenge that I had was that the internal tuner, my 7300, couldn't tune all the bands that I wanted to work. So guess what? I had to buy another tuner. And that set me back, and I bought an automatic tuner, an LDG, the 100 Pro 2 100, something like that. Great tuner, but the problem was it was a couple $100, and it was not factored into my budget. So I made a little bit of a mistake there. I could have bought a different radio or a radio with a different tuner or even a different antenna. Most of the internal tuners will match around 3-to-1 SWR, which is pretty good, but a lot of antennas actually operate outside of that. I know that some amateur radio enthusiasts, purists, will say, I only operate resonant antennas. I would never operate an antenna that needed to be tuned beyond that. What I can tell you is of experienced hams, one of the most favored and beloved antennas is the open wire fed doublet. And you need a pretty robust tuner to work that antenna. And that's kind of all I'm going to say about the doublet. So you might factor in an external tuner. Now, there's radios like the Zygu G90, which has about a 10-to-1 tuner in it, and that tuner works really, really well. And it's a moderately priced radio. It's a great radio. It's about $500. Really good tuner. I believe it does 160 to 10. I should know more about it. I'm actually on my second G90, and it's extremely popular. It does have some limitations, like some of the filtering and receive capability that I talked about earlier, but it's got a really nice built-in tuner, and that might be what's important to you, coupled that with its portability, and that might be the radio. The other one is that you might want to look for radios, and almost all contemporary or modern radios have SWR protection. That means if the tuner is not going to be able to tune your antenna and you're transmitting into a high SWR condition, the radio has foldback. So it detects the SWR and reduces its power output to protect the final amplification stage on your radio. And that's pretty important. So let's talk a little bit about ergonomics and user interface. If you like using your radio, then you're going to use it more. Actually, I have one of my first radios right here. And this is the Yaesu 817ND, and people love this radio. And it's a very capable radio. When it came out, it was a little bit of a game changer. It's 160 to 70 centimeters, has built-in battery, it has two antenna ports on it. Lots of capability when this radio came out that wasn't on the market, and people really like these things. The user interface, look how small that screen is, and the displayed information is very difficult to see. And there's only limited buttons and knobs, so each button has like 5 features. It's not quite 5, I think it's 3. Very difficult radio for me to operate. And as a result, I really didn't like using this radio. I just didn't like it. So I bought something. I bought the 7300, and I loved that radio. It has a really bright, crisp waterfall display and really, really easy to drive menuing system. What it didn't have is a lot of buttons and knobs. And I was like, well, I like a radio with buttons and knobs. Well, a buddy of mine was selling an older Yaesu, and I bought it, tons of buttons and knobs. I thought it was going to be awesome. My eyesight's not the best, and in my shack, I can't read what any of the buttons do. It took a really long time to learn how to use that radio. The other one is I have workflow-friendly design, and again, ICOM has this nailed. And that's if you're going to be able to make a series of configurations to account for a particular operating style or thing that you want to do. All the menu settings are grouped. You don't have to go, well, I have to go into the menu here for this, and then I have to go over here and adjust this knob, and then I got to go back to a different menu. That is difficult. Now, you'll learn all these things as you become more and more familiar with your radio. A lot of people will be like, well, the Yaesu 991A, the menus are impossible. If you have 10 different radios and you're constantly switching between them, your muscle memory is going to take longer to develop. If you have one radio that you use all the time, you're going to be fine. So one of the other considerations is size and portability. I wouldn't recommend you buy a big monster radio and then take it portable all the time. If your goal is to operate portable, buying a smaller, more compact radio is going to be an enabler of taking that radio out portable. This typically means smaller display and less controls on the radio and a more menu-heavy approach as opposed to knobs and switches and buttons that everybody seems to like. The other one is that you want to be comfortable using the radio. So like if you got big fat fingers, sometimes pushing these little buttons might be difficult, and that might be a little bit of a challenge for you. Or in the case of me, if you have bad eyesight, the smaller displays might be difficult to read. We talked about the G90 earlier, really small display. And a lot of people say, hey, I just can't read it. So now you might look at external display, computer-controlled software. So it's just things to consider. You want to make sure you enjoy using your radio. We talked a little bit about field flexibility. I don't think I need to go into that. But if you are going portable, you want something that's durable and it's protectable. Like with this 817 I was showing, I did buy these, I think they're called Portable Zero rails. Buy the metal rails. I'm not trying to hate or anything like that, but The 3D printed rails that people are selling or printing out are more for show than they are protection. Now, they might help you with some minor bumps and things like that, but if your radio takes a spill, you're going to want metal rails on it. So another one that I have here is connectivity and digital mode support. And a lot of times people are like, hey, I don't use computers. I'm not a digital guy. I'm not going to do digital modes. I don't need sound card interfaces. Sound card interfaces make your life a lot easier, and I know lots of hams who got into amateur radio just to talk on the radio who end up falling in love with digital modes. When you have a built-in sound card interface, it makes getting signals in and out of your radio and into a computer interface significantly easier than building custom wires, external sound card interfaces, another device that you need to support, power. When you have the built-in sound card interface, especially if you go portable, it makes configuration and setup a breeze. I mentioned cat control integration, and a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to use computers with my radio. Well, you might not use it for things like digital modes, but people use cat controls for things when they do logging, for example. And you want to be able to integrate your logging software with your radio to make logging a little bit easier and a little bit faster. Cat control integration is pretty important. If you can do your cat control configuration over USB, that's fantastic. Some radios have custom interfaces, or they have DIN connectors where you get a plug and then you have to kind of build your cat control interface, maybe connect through a serial port or like a DB9 connector, which is a little bit more challenging. So I would assume that at some point you are going to use that sound card and you are going to use cat control. And I would look for an easy way to do that. Again, if it's easy, you'll do it. If it's difficult, you won't. Let's talk a little bit about future readiness. So I say, hey, if you're not going to do this, don't buy it. But things like USB connections, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi, if you can get them, super handy and make things really easy. Some people want their radio connected to their home network, so you look for things like an Ethernet port. I like the idea of being able to take the radio output and put that on a computer screen via HDMI. That might not be important to some people, but it's important to others. But for example, I have the Yaesu FTX1, and it does not have HDMI out. I really, really wish it did. But that's built as a portable solution, right? The field version is something that you're going to take out in the field. I'm not going to drag out a big computer with an HDMI input and connect it up out there. So it makes sense that it doesn't have it, but I sure would like it. Now, another thing I want to talk about is reputation and support. And I'm not saying that, hey, you have to buy Kenwood's, Icoms, and Yaesus. There are other companies out there that make radios that are very good radios. But I want to talk about them a little bit because there are companies that might put out a radio and a smaller company might have problems with that radio, but they can't support the firmware for it. So there's lots of firmware revisions over a number of years. And then sometimes bugs and problems exist or persist because the radio just doesn't have the capital to fix them. The other thing is that sometimes radios are just discontinued. So if a company rolls out, different versions essentially of the same radio after 2 or 3 years, it's a really good likelihood that the long-term viability and support for that radio is not going to exist. Companies like Kenwood, Yaesu, and Icom support radios for a decade plus. And that's really handy, especially if you're buying things on the used market. The other thing is if you're here in North America and your radio needs to be serviced or repaired, I sure would like to send it to someplace in the United States. What I don't want to do is end up sending something to Ukraine, Russia, China, because I could have a problem, and it's very expensive to send things back and forth. The other thing, this may not be important to you, but if you have a radio that doesn't have a lot of people using it, getting support from the community, amateur radio operators, can be difficult. It's getting easier today with things like Discord and Facebook groups where people who have the same piece of equipment will gather and talk about things. But if you have a few hundred people using something, the support is going to be different, let's say, if thousands or tens of thousands of people are using that piece of equipment. And that can mean a big difference if you can't figure something out. The other thing is the more commonly known a piece of equipment or a radio is, the more likely you're going to be able to resell it at a good value when it comes time to move on to a different piece of equipment. So I think you need to compare budget with upgrade path. And what we want to do is we want to look for value in a radio over features. We just talked about a ton of features. And I said, hey, you might want this because you could use it in the future. But you really want to make sure that you're getting value for your money. Don't buy something that has every feature or a device, gizmo, bell, or whistle that's super duper expensive. When you buy a radio, you have to consider that I'm going to have to buy coaxial cable. I am going to have to buy interface cables. I might have to buy programming software. I might have to buy remote control software. I have a problem with RFI. Now I need to buy RFI suppression tools. So there's a lot of unexpected costs. So you want to make sure that you're spending your money wisely. And I put in here an antenna first methodology. So $1,000 radio and a cheap antenna is going to sound bad. A $500 radio and a well-built antenna is going to sound better. So you definitely want to consider part of your budget on antennas. Now this is a little bit outside buying your HF rig, but you're going to want an antenna that operates on the bands that you wanted to use, the antenna that is efficient, that works with your tuner, and produces a good signal. So you need to consider that when you're looking at this thing. And learn to build antennas at a fraction of the cost, heavy upfront investment, learning how to do this. But you can build a myriad of antennas and use them in different operating conditions, and you have a pretty good time doing it. And then I have on here growth-ready choices. So you want to make sure that the radio does what you want it to do when you get it, and has some flexibility built in the future in the event that you want to do something else, being mindful not to buy features or functions that you're never going to use. All right, so some final thoughts. What you really want to do is take a look at a balanced approach. You want to make sure that you have performance, usability, and future growth where it makes sense. And you want to make sure that this radio aligns with your operating goals. Remember, we want to reduce frustration and we want to maximize enjoyment. We want to get the most value for our money, and then also have a resale option for that in the event that amateur radio is not for you, or you did make a mistake and you want to get a different radio. What I have next is knowledge beats specs. And so this is kind of like an ounce of prevention, pound of cure kind of thinking. Take some time to become an educated consumer. What I'm not advocating is analysis paralysis, where I've talked to hams who are like, hey, I've got a spreadsheet that has every radio that's made, features, functions, price. Because the thing is that when you have too many data points and too many considerations, you're probably still going to make a wrong choice. Canvass your ham club. Talk to hams. Find out what they're doing, what you're interested in, what you want to do. Look at the market and make an informed choice, but don't go overboard. And you want to make sure you get the right fit. You want the right radio for you at the right price that's going to make you happy. Anyhow, that's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or recommendations, go ahead and post them below, and I'll do my best to respond.